Hello, everybody. Welcome to another First Fridays at the museum. I'm so excited that you're here. This is a momentous occasion. Today, we're launching our Norman Rockwell in the 1940s, a view of the American Homefront. And when I say our, this is actually on loan from the Norman Rockwell Museum. And I am just thrilled to have been working on the show. It's incredible. It's a great kind of view of what was happening in America. Norman Rockwell, as you're all familiar with him, and how it was his view of America, kind of, that we all identify with. It's an idealized world, kind of looking through his lens. But today we have more than me talking about it. We have Stephanie Haboush Plunkett, who's going to be talking. She's the Deputy Director and Chief Curator of the Norman Rockwell Museum in Massachusetts. She's the curator of so many exhibitions that have been national and international, including Enduring Ideals, which was Rockwell, Roosevelt, and the Four Freedoms. The Four Freedoms, by the way, are going to be we have the tear sheet, or not tear sheets, illustrations of them in the museum right now. They're incredible. I can't wait for you guys to see this show. It's a beautiful installation, and it's a beautiful show that she put together. She also leads the Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies. We were kind of kibitzing about that before we opened up, just because it's the scholarly institute on illustration. And there's always a discussion between illustration and fine art. And Rockwell himself had definitely he was dealing with that as well, as was his work in the fine art realm or in the illustration realm. And I think his modesty comes through when you listen more about him. And I hope Stephanie talks a little bit about that. Not to put you on the spot, Stephanie. Any case, I think this is after Stephanie, we're going to actually then go into where we went back to some oral histories that we have. We did some present ones where we have some present histories, remembrances of World War II, but we also went back into some of the oral histories. And so a couple of those that we were able to grab, and I'm so excited to share them with you, just so you can hear about World War II on the island. This is the 80th year. This is why we're doing this show. We're the Museum for Art and History. And so Rockwell's talking about World War II in America. We're talking about World War II on the island. We were instrumental in so many aspects of the preparation, the training, and the fight for World War II. It's exciting to hear these firsthand remembrances from the war. And so that's why we're bringing this program together, and that's why we're excited that you're here. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie so she can introduce you to Norman Rockwell in the 1940s, a view of the American Homefront.
Great. Thank you so much, Johnny. I am absolutely thrilled to be with you today. And it's just wonderful that we do have Zoom that can bring us together, me being on the East Coast, you on the West Coast. And thank you so much to the staff of the Catalina Island Museum. We are very, very honored to work with you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and show you some images and talk a little bit about kind of a whirlwind tour, really, to provide a little bit of background on Rockwell himself. And then, of course, we want to talk about some of the images in the exhibition as well. So I'll just start by saying that public engagement with the history of popular images has accelerated in the 21st century. And there's a growing awareness that illustration has mattered more in the modern period than has been properly recognized. My comments, as I say, will share background on Rockwell's life and career and on Catalina's new installation, which features many significant Saturday Evening Post illustrations from the World War II era that have forged a sense of national identity and become memorable cultural icons. It's my pleasure to represent the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. That's what you're seeing here. And we are dedicated to the art of illustration in all its variety. We have a collection of about 850 original works by Rockwell and an extensive archive. And we also have Rockwell Studio. So the building that you see in the picture in the upper left, this one right here, is Rockwell's 19th century converted carriage barn. And the white colonial house that you see here was his home. So you can see how close his studio was to his home. And the building was actually placed in trust to the museum prior to Rockwell's death, and it is now on our grounds. So we're able to share it with people, which is very, very nice. You see Rockwell here in his studio on the first Princess telephone in town because, well, he lived in Stockbridge, Massachusetts for his last 25 years. And he actually got the first call that was not operator assisted. So it's kind of fun. I'll just mention that we also hold about 25,000 works by other illustrators, both historical and contemporary. And as Johnny mentioned, we do travel our exhibitions of Rockwell art and tear sheets throughout the nation and the world. So that's really been a wonderful experience. America's most prominent 20th century illustrator, Rockwell was revered by the public and reviled by many in the art world, as Johnny said, but his paintings were made to last. Created for the covers and pages of our nation's periodicals rather than for the walls of galleries and museums, his intricate narratives imbued ordinary activities with a sense of historical importance, seizing the moment almost as it was about to fade. Replaced at the turn of a page by a succession of magazine issues and illustrations, he called the history of European art into play, employing classical painting methodology to weave contemporary tales inspired by everyday people and places. And here he, of course, refers to Peter Paul Rubens. A cast of affable, exquisitely painted characters and a plethora of supporting details kept him and his audience engaged and inspired belief by millions in the uniquely American vision that he conceived and continued to refine. In 1943, a Time magazine reporter noted that Rockwell constantly achieves that compromise between a love of realism and the tendency to idealize, which is one of the most deeply ingrained characteristics of the American people. And here we see him with all of the studies that he did for one Saturday Evening Post cover that would appear on the cover of the magazine for just 1 week. It also gives you a sense of the scale of his original paintings. Rockwell was witness to important modernist and postmodern art movements, from Impressionism and Cubism to Surrealism, Abstract Expressionism, and pop art. But in choosing a path of illustration, he earned his reputation as one of Americans' preeminent visual commentators, helping to forge a sense of national identity through his art. He once commented famously, sorry, I missed that, that while he enjoyed receiving admiring letters from the public, he said, "I'd love it if the critics would notice me too." But in mid-century, abstract art had successfully attracted collectors and critics whose passion for visceral, less readable artworks was in itself noteworthy. And this seismic shift in the art world also impacted the world of illustration, as many prominent practitioners championed more expressive symbolic styles, as we see here in the work of Barbara Nessum on the left and Robert Weaver on the right. In today's digital age, it's difficult to recall the role that magazines played when periodicals served as the primary source for information and entertainment. The ongoing focus of visual artists, filmmakers, and photographers, storytelling in pictures predates verbal language. And here, Rockwell is having a good time by gaining inspiration from Michelangelo's Prophet Isaiah, you can see on the left, from the Sistine ceiling in Rome, of course, and his 1943 portrayal of Rosie the Riveter is on the right. And of course, he gains, wonderful inspiration from the pose and styling of the image. And in this case, Rosie's foot is planted firmly on Mein Kampf. To step back a bit, Rockwell was born in New York City on February 3rd, 1894. The earliest evidence of his art interest appears in his remembrances of his father copying illustrations from magazines in the evening after dinner. And you're actually seeing one of his father's copies on the right. And this is actually Rockwell right here, the lower boy, his older brother Jarvis here, and his parents, Nancy and Jarvis Rockwell. Even more permanently etched in Rockwell's memory were images evoked by English writer Charles Dickens. Read aloud in the evenings after dinner, Dickens' stories inspired Rockwell to portray the characters as he listened. And Rockwell read Dickens throughout his life, adopting the author's literary view and rich sense of characterization. Rockwell began his full-time study of art after his sophomore year in high school at the National Academy School in New York, but he quickly transferred to the Art Students League, and you're actually seeing him standing here at a class. He's the one standing up next to the model. He was visiting after his so-called graduation in 1912, but this is a little bit later. He had already become a rather successful illustrator. It was not long before the editor of the Boy Scouts monthly magazine, Boy's Life, asked Rockwell to illustrate a Boy Scout handbook. And as a youth of just 19, Rockwell was retained as art director of the magazine, which was expanding to national circulation. Even in these early works, Rockwell insisted on making each character a unique individual. And what I'll just mention here is Rockwell actually worked for the Boy Scouts for about 50 years. The one on the left is a very early work, an illustration of Daniel Boone. And on the right, a later piece that actually refers to the Great Flood of 1938 in New England. In 1916, when Rockwell was 22, he submitted the piece on the left to the Saturday Evening Post, which he considered to be America's greatest show window in America for an illustrator. And of course, that was the Saturday Evening Post. At the time, and he and his family were living in boarding houses in New Rochelle, New York, a suburb of the city that actually had more illustrators per capita than any other town in the country, which is rather amazing. It was like 45 minutes from Broadway, so an easy trip by train to New York. In the 1920s, as Rockwell's popularity soared, he typically spent 12 to 14 hours a day in his studio. Curtis Publishing became the primary purveyor of Rockwell's illustrations in its 3 magazines, the Saturday Evening Post, Ladies' Home Journal, and Country Gentleman. And the piece you're seeing here is a story illustration for Ladies' Home Journal. And I wanted to pull out some of these beautiful details because, really his sense of light and ability to paint characters and cloth and hair and fur, that great visual texture that he became very well known for. In the 1930s, a major influence on Rockwell's art came not from an artistic movement or style, but from using photography. He said, "The wear and tear and strain of working with living models placed on me was awful. I would sit for 8 hours yelling, 'Lift eyebrows, raise that arm a little, and make that smile bigger.' I would carry out all these gestures and facial expressions myself, and by the end of the day, I was so nervous that I was ready to drop." So you're seeing some of his models here in Arlington, Vermont. Rockwell said he never got over the feeling that using photography to capture models' poses was cheating, and years passed before he publicly admitted to his use of photographic reference. which became an essential tool for his deadline-driven career, and of course for other illustrators as well. The woman on the right here who's posing for the gossips is his wife, Mary, the mother of his three sons, their three sons. In 1939, a move to Vermont brought a whole new retinue of models. And after a 1943 fire destroyed his studio, complete with costumes, references, and prop collections, he reevaluated his choice of subjects as well. Rockwell had always wanted to be topical and record the current scene, and now his artistic path was fixed. And you can see that, Rockwell's sort of a great humorist. He's making a cartoon that deals with this subject of this rather serious studio fire in which he could not contact the fire department because his line was dead. But in true Rockwell fashion, at the end down here, all the firemen gather around for sandwiches as the studio smolders. During World War II, distant from the activities of the war raging in Europe, Rockwell was challenged to record its effects on the servicemen and Americans at home. His only image of a soldier in battle, designed to stimulate ammunition production at munitions factories, featured a powerful machine gunner for the poster, "Let's give him enough and on time." But he wanted to do more for the war effort and decided to illustrate Franklin D. Roosevelt's Four Freedoms ideals, presented during the president's January 1941 address to Congress. Finding new ideas for paintings never came easily, but this was a greater challenge. While considering his approach, Rockwell, by chance, attended a town meeting where a Vermont neighbor was met with respect when he rose among his neighbors to voice an unpopular view. And as it happened, the town school had burned down. And there was one farmer who really didn't want higher taxes. So he was concerned about rebuilding the school. And Rockwell expressed the idea that even though everyone else was in favor of rebuilding, he was able to state his opinion and be met with, as I said, a feeling of respect. And you'll notice here in the corner, this half of the face kind of peeking in, that is actually Norman Rockwell. And he's really kind of expressing his presence in that moment. That night, the artist awoke with a realization that he could best paint the Four Freedoms from the perspective of his own experiences, using everyday scenes to illuminate Roosevelt's abstract ideals. Despite some early misgivings, Rockwell's Four Freedoms were a phenomenal success, even receiving praise from his friend and fellow artist, Walt Disney. After their publication, the magazine received thousands of requests for reprints, and in April 1943, the Post and the U.S. Department of Treasury announced a joint campaign to sell war bonds and stamps, capitalizing on Rockwell's vision. I must say this is probably the most parodied of all the Four Freedoms. We have seen this kind of iconic composition with Disney characters and people on their cell phones instead of talking to each other. Lots of really interesting variations. But you see here, this is actually Norman Rockwell's mother on the right, Nancy Hill Rockwell, the woman with the white hair. On the left here, second from the bottom, is Mary Rockwell, his wife, as I mentioned earlier. And the man peeking out and looking at you, try to give you a sense that you're kind of welcome in the scene, is the only one of Rockwell's models to appear in all four of the Four Freedoms. So what occurred, which was rather remarkable, was that Roosevelt's words and Rockwell's imagery soon became inseparable in the public consciousness, with millions of reproductions bringing the Four Freedoms directly into American homes and workplaces. Freedom from fear is probably his most somber of the four. And it's hard to see in the slide, but on the newspaper, there's a heading basically that says bombings, hit, and horror. So of course, it's a reference to the war overseas. And Rockwell was the father of three sons, and he basically said that this painting was meant to portray the thought that all parents should be able to put their children to bed at night without fear. Rockwell found it a challenge to record his interpretations of the effects of World War II on servicemen for Americans at home. But his unassuming private named Willie Gillis, who was represented in the exhibition, told the story of one man's army in a series of popular Saturday Evening Post covers. He depicted Willie engaged in mundane tasks like receiving a care package from home, peeling potatoes, or reading the hometown news. The artist met his Willie Gillis model, Robert Otis Bob Buck, at an Arlington, Vermont square dance. Then 15 years of age, Buck was still too young to fight, but he eventually began his service in 1943 as a naval aviator in the South Seas. His first Willie Gillis cover appeared on October 4th, 1941, and his last emerged after the war when this familiar character enrolled in college on the GI Bill, and you actually see him here studying with the Tower of Williams College in the background. No, I'm sorry, it's Middlebury College in Vermont. That is a tower at the school. Published widely, Willie Gillis enlargements were distributed by the USO, ultimately appearing in USO clubs at home and abroad, as well as in railway stations and bus terminals. Rosie the Riveter emerged as an emblem of the working woman during World War II. She was the heart of a campaign aimed at recruiting female workers for defense industries, visualized in the early 1940s, first, before Norman Rockwell, on the right-hand side by J. Howard Miller. And this image became very famous, but interestingly, it was created for the Westinghouse Company, and it was only posted internally. And the way that it became famous was that the Smithsonian Institution actually was given a copy of all of Miller's World War II posters, and it was exhibited and then went on to become kind of an emblem of woman power and female power, the ability to do anything. Rosie represented the women who entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers during the war. In 1943, when Rockwell painted Liberty Girl, more than 310,000 women were employed in the US aircraft industry alone, making up 65% of its total workforce compared to just 1% in the pre-war years. I'm just showing you on the right-hand side, there's a drawing for Liberty Girl. Liberty Girl is essentially the girl next door who can do just about anything. And generally when Rockwell worked, he began with a small thumbnail sketch, but eventually worked up to a very detailed charcoal drawing that was about the same size as his finished painting. So you can see he is kind of working some things through. There's actually in the drawing, there's a swastika and a rising sun, and those do not appear in his final illustration. During World War II, Rockwell's humanistic portrayals of soldiers on the American Homefront were a reassuring presence in the popular press during trying times. He received many fan letters from Saturday Evening Post readers who appreciated Rockwell's artistry and the stories that he chose to tell, and his portrayal of a GI returning home to an overjoyed community of family and friends received rave reviews. The picture is an instance of American humanity at its best, wrote Mr. and Mrs. M. Epstein in May 1945. And another from Mrs. Grace Page said, your cover of the May 26th Saturday Evening Post is wonderful. The family resemblances, the returning soldier, the neighbors from all nations looking out to greet him, even the old-fashioned screen door are perfect. But there's one thing lacking. There should have been a cat rubbing against the soldier's legs, evidently purring loudly. And it's really interesting what we learn about people's reactions to Rockwell's work in the moment from all of those letters, which we have in the archives. According to an editor at the Saturday Evening Post, Rockwell's initial intention for this Thanksgiving cover of 1945 consisted of a large group of prayerful people giving thanks. But when the painting was underway, the end of the war was already in sight, and editor Ken Stewart advised Rockwell to work on a picture of a returned soldier. The concept for Rockwell's picture is that the soldier is glad to do at home what he hated doing in the army. So we see him here peeling potatoes with his mother. And there are some really nice touches. He's still in uniform, but he's wearing civilian shoes, as you can see here. And he's sitting on a chair that almost looks too small for him, as though it might have been a chair that he sat on as a boy. At the end of the war, Rockwell employed the inspiring symbol of the Statue of Liberty and the team of workers working diligently to keep her flame shining brightly. It's interesting to note that the original painting is now in the collection of the White House, a gift during the Clinton administration from Steven Spielberg, who's a collector of Rockwell's art, that hung in President Obama's Oval Office. And one interesting thing I'll note is that you'll notice that it's a diverse group of workers. And we do see that there's an African-American worker here, and the Post did tend to be a fairly conservative magazine. So it is not often that African-Americans and people of color were seen on the covers of the magazine in anything other than service roles. These and many other works, which toward the end of the decade signaled a return to normalcy during the post-war era, are on view in Norman Rockwell in the 1940s, which I hope you'll have a chance to visit. In closing, I'll just say that for 6 decades, Rockwell inspired Americans by helping them to see the best in themselves. When he shifted his attention to significant social concerns, he faced an audience ready to receive his messages. In 1977, President Gerald R. Ford honored Rockwell with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest peacetime award, for having portrayed the American scene with unrivaled freshness and clarity, and with insight, optimism, and good humor. With the onset of dementia and the effects of emphysema resulting from years of pipe smoking, Rockwell could no longer do the work that had so completely and passionately driven his life. In 1978, the artist died at home at the age of 84, having made an immeasurable contribution to our nation through his art. And we are so pleased that some of that material will and is now showcased in Catalina. So thank you so much. And I'll look forward to, after the program is over, taking any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was a great presentation. It's an incredible show. Seeing that combination of idealism and the everyday that Rockwell did, it really hits home to Catalina. The communities that he portrays is heartfelt, and it's also something that being here on the island I can identify with. And I think there's a way when looking through the tear sheets that are currently in the museum, we're all Willie Gillis in some way, and it's interesting to identify with the subject and also as the viewer. And that brings me to all of them are they're humorous and they're heartwarming, but they're also very haunting. And his touch on humanity. And that brings me to also heartwarming and haunting stories that we're going to go listen to now of Catalina Island residents and also people that served on the island during World War II. So join me now as we listen to some of those oral histories. So everybody, I would like to welcome Bill Pence to our program. Bill, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So you were actually, you were stationed on Catalina, or were you living on Catalina during World War II?
Yes, I was born at Avalon. I was born September 1st, 1933 in Avalon in a one-bedroom apartment. My father was a fisherman, a boat owner and a sports fishing guide. My mother came over in 1931 for a week's vacation and met my dad, who took her to the casino and then out sport fishing. And in November that year, they were married. Fantastic. And so I was the only child of that union. In 1941, when the war started, things started, I was in third grade at the Avalon Elementary School up the hill. And with Mrs. Wallace, as I recall, was my teacher. This was the second year I'd had her, because at that time, the second grade and the third grade were combined. There was just one teacher in one room for both grades. The number of kids was probably about 20 kids in the room total between the two grades. So I had her wound up having her for 2 years. On December 7th, I remember very distinctly, it was a Sunday, and I didn't have to go to school. My father left early in the morning to go down and do some work on the boat. And about 7 a.m., I had breakfast with my mother, and we turned on our Philco radio and heard the news of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I immediately jumped up, ran 2 blocks down to the beach and out the pleasure pier to the end, and started trying to get a hold of catch the eye of my father, who was working on the boat. I could see him in his cockpit. He didn't respond to me. And I remember getting very, very excited and very upset that he would not respond. Finally, he did, after several, probably 15 or 20 minutes. And he got in a skiff and rowed back to the pleasure pier. And it turned out that he had already heard about Pearl Harbor. He'd been listening to his shortwave radio on the boat and listening to the news there. And that's why he didn't respond to me initially, because he was busy listening to the news. Oh. And so that was the first day. That was December 7th, 1941. Very memorable day to me. Right after that, as we proceeded into the first days of the war, I remember initially my mother getting very busy making blackout curtains for the house. And I guess all the other women in town did the same, because immediately the town blacked out. All the stores shut down and the lights were turned off. Everything was out at night. And I remember to me, it was very spooky to be out in the evening walking a little around, and there were no lights anywhere. Huh. It was all black. And quite a few people, I guess, left the island. I remember 2 of my buddies, Ziggy and redheaded Billy, disappeared. They were no longer in school, and I didn't see them anymore. So I don't know. So some people left the island. The news, of course, war news was quite bad at that time. And there was my dad. I remember my dad and some of the other men in the Avalon went up on the hill to the new airport that was up there, and cut down trees and laid trunks and out-of-date equipment and all across the airfield to prevent the Japanese planes from landing there. Anyway, there was a lot of consternation and concern. part of the problem, as far as we were concerned at Avalon, was that we were very tightly hooked into what I call the fisherman's grapevine. And so we had information coming from San Pedro, Santa Barbara, Monterey, San Diego, through fishermen by way of shortwave radio and or phone calls, because a lot of the fishermen were related. They were cousins and uncles and what have you. And so we had a lot of information flowing in, and we knew right away that there were no naval ships on the west coast of the United States. There was the only one that was around was, I think, the Saratoga, an aircraft carrier that was in dry dock in Puget Sound, undergoing some major overhaul. And so the west coast was completely undefended at that point. The fleet had all been removed over to Pearl Harbor and to Guam and to Subic Bay in the Philippines to stand off against the perceived possible aggression by Japan.
So you knew.
So we knew right away within the first few days of the war that there was no protective fleet or anything on the west coast to protect us, and that was disturbing. So immediately the steamer shut down. There was no major flow of goods or people to the island, and the steamer was replaced by water taxi service. The water taxis, you may know, are about 50, 60 feet long, basically open. The passenger benches are covered by the canvas covers, very similar to the Blanche W, but smaller than the Blanche W. And they provided service for transporting people back and forth to San Pedro, and also brought us the newspapers, and the U.S. mail came that way. Also one of our two grocery stores shut down, and there was just one grocery store, and the food and other supplies like that started coming in by barge, which unloaded at the gas stock by the casino. There was a crane there, and they lifted goods off the barges and put them on small pickup trucks. Yeah, so I'm watching all this going on. Yeah, so that was we were in the war very definitely, and felt a very part of the whole situation. And of course, to me, the big thing was how quiet. I mean, the town just went still, because Avalon had always been a busy commotion place, full of tourists and visitors. All the winters were quiet. The population at that time dropped down to around 800 in the middle of the winter, but still there was activity on the weekends and all, especially. So anyway, so that's besides at that point, the big thing that, besides the fear of an invasion or an attack by the Japanese, the thing that was concerning my father and the other boat owners and fishermen at the Avalon was how to make a living during that, because they knew that the sport fishing business, which they'd all depended upon, was dead. It was not going to come back during the war. And so there was a big what to do and how to make some living in that situation. And it turned out that about the best thing they could come up with was fishing for shark. And there was a price for shark liver at that time to make vitamins, particularly for the soldiers. And I guess if you something to like cod liver oil, I guess I used to take as a kid, but they processed the livers of the sharks to make vitamins, and there was a pretty good market for shark livers. But catching the sharks was a big hassle, pain. It was not only hard work for the men, but it was also dangerous for the boats, because you had to set your set lines and nets right in close to the rocks and beaches at Avalon, around Catalina, and there was a danger of losing your boat on the rocks when you were working in that close. Yeah, so that was the other thing that came on quite early, within a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. What to do about, what should we do? What should the fishermen do? And we had a fish and game warden on Avalon at the time. His name was Smith. Everybody called him Smitty. And he had a 36-foot boat, considered fast, and a chase boat for the fish and game chases. And he was chosen to be the leader. And the boat could do about 12 knots, which was good for those days. And he had a very good shortwave radio. He had excellent equipment radio equipment on the boat. So it was decided to form a patrol. And that's
what Sam was.
That's what Sam. Yeah, my dad was part of the team that went with. They went out each night. They started going out every night from Avalon and circling around the backside of the island in the channel between San Clemente, Santa Barbara Islands, and Catalina, looking for something, whatever, I think. And around the 1st of March, probably, we got a contingent of Coast Guardsmen that came to the island, and they set up camp in the harbor master's office on top of the Joe Arno and Sal Arno's fish market at the end of the pleasure pier. And they brought a boat. It was an old sailboat, what we called a motor sailor. It had big masts and it was all painted gray. They were they took the patrol duty going around the island at night looking for submarines or whatever. And the sailors coming said it was a terrible boat. It rolled something ferocious, and the guys got seasick riding on the thing. It was very slow, probably about 7 or 8 knots top speed.
A sailboat.
It had been a sailboat. Yeah. Anyway, that was our defensive operation. The other thing, the main thing that the Coast Guard did at that point was they started checking the boats in and out. And it's hard to explain exactly, but there was almost a paranoia situation about spies and saboteurs coming in by fishing boat and joining with, say, the Japanese people or whatever that were living in that Los Angeles and all, and then blowing up our aircraft factories. If you remember, there was the big aircraft factories were in LA, Douglas Air in Long Beach, Lockheed, and Northrop over a little bit further inland. And these were 3 of the biggest producers of warplanes at that time in the United States.
So they started checking.
So they starting at that, when the Coast Guard showed up, they began checking the fishing boats, and my dad and all the boaters had to paint the name, not the name, but the number of their boats, registered boat numbers, on the side of the boats in big black print, and so that they could be seen from a distance. And then they all received a fishing boat permit number, which had to be shown on a sign on the cabin or the top of the cabin. And they could not go out or come in after dark. So you couldn't leave the harbor until daylight, and you had to return before dark, which made things rather tricky in some ways for the fishermen. And they were inspected in and out by the Coast Guardmen that were stationed there on the pleasure pier. And that was started. They were still fishing shark. There weren't very many boats running. There were a few boats came over from San Pedro to fish shark, along with the Catalina boatmen, but it wasn't a big thing. The big point of that era at the Avalon was how quiet it was. I mean, the place was really dead. I mean, people had left. There was no tourists coming in. It was just quiet and again blacked out at night. No lights at night. No neon lights anywhere. No restaurants or anything. Yeah, the before the war, we had two grocery stores. One of them shut down and the other one was still operating. My mom had to have a booklet of stamps, and the stamps were different colors, and the different colors represented different products you could buy, and that you had to buy, the certain quantity, and I think like meat, I think we could only buy on certain days of the week, but it was, so she had to present her stamps at the grocery store to get food. The food was, quality of food declined quite a bit, and we were eating a lot of canned goods and fish, local fish and what have you. So at that time, as soon as the weather cleared up in February or March, Mrs. Wallace led us out to the side of the school building, and we took shovels and we prepared a victory garden, and we planted vegetables alongside the school, the elementary school there, and which turned out to be fun and interesting for us kids, but it didn't produce any produce, because as soon as the seeds would germinate and come up to the surface, the deer would come down from the hills and eat the food, eat our vegetables. Yeah. And in fact, possibly because of the blackout and so few people, the deer just invaded the town of Avalon, and they were a terrible nuisance. They not only ate people's victory gardens, but they were also eating up their flowers and their bushes and all sorts of stuff. And at night they were wandering all around the town. And so it was the deer. I don't know why nobody decided that they wanted some venison for dinner, but I can't remember any cases where anybody shot a deer or took advantage of the free meat. But we did eat goat on occasion, and we did eat very rarely some of the wild pigs from the island. But I don't recall anybody ever eating deer. Yeah. Anyway, so that was kind of the way things were going. It was rough life. My dad was fishing shark and didn't like it, and things were very quiet until I think it was around June. You have to check details on that. All right. All of a sudden, then the Merchant Marine showed up, and somebody decided to put the Merchant Marine training school at Avalon. And all of a sudden, all the hotels were full, and all these men coming in to be trained as merchant seamen to fill up the Liberty ships and the other boats that were being built like crazy along the West Coast and the East Coast. And of course, that brought in instructors also. The trainees were in the hotels, and the instructors, many of them either bought or rented homes in Avalon. And in fact, that fall of 1942, my fourth grade teacher was the wife of one of the instructors that had come over. She just arrived in Avalon, but she was a school teacher, so she took a job as fourth grade teacher, and she was young and beautiful, and I thought she was wonderful. Yeah. Anyway, so that's.
Yeah.
But that changed. All of a sudden, this town started to become back alive again at that when the Merchant Marine showed up. And then in the 1st of July, there was a gift from God as far as the fishermen were concerned. The albacore tuna came back to the waters around Catalina Island. They had been missing for a number of years, but they came in a large quantity, large schools of the albacore tuna, which is the premier tuna grade, the white can tuna, and the price was very good, and they were easy to catch. And all of a sudden, all the fishermen, my dad and all the others, were fishing for albacore. And that also attracted a lot of fishermen from San Pedro, from Newport Beach, from all over the West Coast, who came, and by July, mid to late July, the harbor at Avalon was full again of boats but there were commercial fishing boats fishing for albacore.
That's like 7 months.
And they were, and so, and that's from that point on, from I'd say right around August of 1942, the whole situation at Avalon just changed dramatically. It went from being super quiet and super fearful and black at night to suddenly just booming again with all these merchant marine trainees coming in and all these fishermen who were making a lot of money and were basing out of Avalon. And were buying gasoline, they were buying food, they were doing, and if they could get it, they were buying booze in town and what have you. So yeah, it was interesting. And of course the merchant marine were there and they were buying. I began that in September when I began making quite a bit of money shining shoes for the cadets. They all wore these leather shoes, black leather shoes, and they had to keep, I guess, polished for the inspections. And so there was quite a market. And I had a
Industrious.
I had a box and my shoe shine paste and rags, and I did quite well shining shoes for the merchant mariners.
Some things don't change.
Yeah, I also made did quite well. I owned my own skiff at that time. And so I was the fishermen I mentioned coming in, the albacore fishermen and others. Well, a lot of them didn't have skiffs of their own on the boat. So they needed to get ashore, and there was no shore boats. The shore boats had been discontinued. And so I did pretty well acting as a shore boat with my own skiff. I'd go out and pick guys up, 2 bits to go ashore and 2 bits to leave shore and go back to the boat. And so I did quite well.
All this for a 4th grader.
Yeah. I was from
rolling and dough.
From July, August forward until we've through the winter, that I was rolling in money. I had my own savings account and at the Security First National Bank there on Crescent Street, and I was doing well.
We should have you do a program with the school here for the 4th graders.
No, don't give any ideas.
Yeah. So I'd say that was the big thing of the early years of the war. That was it. The first few months, from December through April or May, where the town was dead. I mean, it was under bad things. Nothing was going well, and we were all fearful, and nights were black. Everything blacked out, and it was a very spooky period. And then from about June on, with the arrival of the merchant marine, and then with the arrival of the albacore fishing, all of a sudden it went overnight almost to being almost as busy as it had been on a normal summer's weekend in 1941 or 40. And so it was a huge change. And anyway, I continued on in April of 1943. The next April, I was still in the 4th grade, and my dad decided to move the family and the boat to Newport Beach. And so we left the island in May of 1943. And,
I had been spending all my summers here since I was a baby. And so we were told that we could come over and check our property, but we couldn't come on a permanent situation unless we were people who worked here, people who had jobs and were part of the economy. The economy at that time had been dependent on tourists. And of course, it was no longer possible to have tourists over here. And I think it was in 42, a certain month, that they cut it off and they said, okay, you can't go over anymore. But if you're a property owner or a resident who is still living on the island, because many were transferred over to the mainland, as I'm sure you know, they said we could get a Coast Guard ID pass, and it enabled us to come over. So we would come over ostensibly to check the property and actually just to have a good time. So I left the Ice Follies and came home, and Mother and I thought, oh, it'd be fun to come over to the island. So I met a very good-looking, handsome maritime officer, and we ended up going to dances. And you know where the market is, Vaughn's Express? Well, that was originally a gym, and they used to play games there, basketball particularly, and we'd go watch, and then they'd have dances there, and it was great fun. So we were not allowed to go to past the Casino Way arch that sits out there. You couldn't go out to the casino. You couldn't go to the St. Catherine, which was still there and was used as barracks. I had an interesting thing happen. Mother and I were over, and it rained, a real bad rainstorm, and the boat didn't run, which incidentally was the Avalon that was running in. A lot of us who used the cross-channel transportation a lot preferred the Avalon to the SS Catalina. I think my mother, for example, liked to get one of the little staterooms, and she liked the way it sailed better, and it wasn't quite as big. But everybody has their own personal taste. So we couldn't go back. We were delayed, I think, 2 or 3 days, which made it possible for me to see this guy another night. But the day we did leave was a bright, sunny, gorgeous day. So all of a sudden, here go 5 or 7 flying Avengers, which was one of the fighter planes with the Air Force. And they went flying over, and then they'd come out, and they'd fly back again. And we thought, oh, don't they look neat? Maybe they're showing off for us. And then all of a sudden, we noticed there's a sub-chaser on one side and a minesweeper on the other. And we're tootling along over. And they announced we would be going into the Long Beach entrance to the harbor rather than by the lighthouse that goes into San Pedro and Wilmington. And because the mines, some of them had broken loose in the storm. So we think, oh, that's kind of interesting, you know. So we go through, uneventful, and it was pretty exciting. Well, quite a long time later, I was talking to a friend of mine that had been in the Navy, and he was connected with by this time, they call it the CIA. Mickey said, you know, something really interesting happened over at Catalina. He was stationed down in the South Pacific. He said they had a scare over there. And I said, well, I don't remember anything like that. And I told him about the time we'd gone over with the planes and so on and so forth. And he said that was it. He said a Japanese sub sank a merchant marine ship in the channel. And they had never publicized it because they didn't want to scare people to death here on the coast. So anyway, I had this little bit of information. I thought, gosh, isn't that interesting? And I told my mother, and we talked about it. And they had also fired up the old gun, the machine gun, on the stern of the ship. Well, we thought they were just shooting at seagulls or something, and it was so old it was like a Gatling gun almost, you know. So at any rate, we got over to the mainland, and that was that. But then my friend told me a few years later, and it was after the end of the war. So I was skating at the St. Regis Hotel in New York, and I did different things on ice. I did ballet and jazz, and that picture up at the edges was when I did the hula. So between shows, they let me go out and dance. Up waltzes this man with his Polynesian-looking wife, and he said, pardon me, Miss Sook, I am General Spots of the U.S. Air Force, and this is my wife so-and-so. Oh, Major General Spots, he said. He was very nice, and he said, my wife was born in Hawaii. We've lived there for many years, and we have never seen a mainland hula that we liked. So we were amazed to find that the one we liked was yours and was on ice. And I said, that's the nicest thing you could have ever said. So he said, where are you from? And I said, Catalina Island in California, because I always tell people that. And he said, how did you ever learn to skate out there? And which people always do. And so I told him I'd only been on natural ice 3 times in my life when I joined the ice hockey, which is neither here nor there. But he said, Catalina, he said, did you go over during the war? And I said, yes, because we were property owners and we were allowed to with a Coast Guard ID pass. And he said, yeah, some pretty interesting things happened over there. And I said, yes. And I told him the story about our trip and the planes and the minesweeper and stuff chaser. And he said, how did you know that? And I thought, oops, I shouldn't get Mickey into trouble. He was no longer in the service, but I said, well, a friend of mine was with the CIA and was Navy and was down in, I guess, intelligence, Central Intelligence. So I said he was the one that told me about it, and that was just recently after the war. And he said, well, it's true.
This is called The Japanese Sub Story. Bill Pence sent me about 14 stories about my grandfather, who was a fisherman on the island. And Bill used to fish with his dad, and they were in the same fleet. So Bill Pence sent me all kinds of stories about my grandfather, and this is one about when World War II was just starting. And so I'm quoting him. This is from Bill. This story was told to me by Sam Riccolo, and all its main parts were confirmed by Nick Vojkovic. Nick Vojkovic is the grandfather to Joanne Arnold and Kathleen Bombard-Vojkovic, and other participants in the events. I was an eyewitness to the last event of the story. Within days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, everyone at Catalina Island was aware that the entire west coast of the United States was completely unprotected. The only naval vessel on the whole coast was the aircraft carrier Saratoga that was in dry dock at Bremerton, Washington, undergoing repairs. We felt very exposed and threatened. I remember my dad and other men going into the hills behind Avalon to dig foxholes. They also cut down trees and blocked off the runway of the airport in the sky so that no plane could land there. We blacked out our homes every night so that the town was not visible from the sea. The boatmen decided that they should begin a patrol of the waters outside Catalina to warn the army at San Pedro if a Japanese invasion fleet was approaching. The fish and game cruiser Skipjack that was stationed in Avalon was selected as the patrol boat. Captained by Smitty Smith, it was 36 feet long and had a maximum top speed of 12 knots. And that was one of the fastest boats in Avalon. The boatmen formed up 2 crews which alternated going on patrol with Smitty each night. Sam took along his double-barrel shotgun, and my dad had a 36 millimeter revolver. Someone else had a sporting rifle. They weren't too concerned about firepower because they had seen photos of the Japanese submarines captured at Pearl Harbor, and those were 2-man suicide subs, which were smaller than the Skipjack and had no deck guns. If they found one of them sneaking around Catalina, they were positive they could run it down and capture it. My memory's not clear on the exact date, but it was right around Christmas 1941. My dad was not aboard the Skipjack that night, but Sam and Nick were, along with Smitty and a couple of other boatmen. They left Avalon after dark and cruised down to Seal Rocks at the east end of the island. They turned around Church Rock and headed west up along the Palisades toward Silver Canyon. About midnight, they saw a light flash out in the middle of the channel between Catalina and San Clemente Island. Smitty radioed into the Army at San Pedro and asked if there was any ship traffic known to be in the area. The Army replied no, there were no vessels in the vicinity. The Army suggested the Skipjack go out and investigate. Smitty headed the Skipjack towards the west end of San Clemente, and all aboard got ready for some type of action. Skipjack was cruising at 7 or 8 knots with no lights showing. As they arrived in the area where they had seen the flash of light, it was totally dark and calm. Suddenly, there was a churning of white water off the starboard side of the skipjack, about 2 football fields distant. A huge submarine pushed up out of the sea, traveling in the same direction as the skipjack. Of course, it was an ocean-going sub, probably almost as long as the Catalina steamer, not a mini 2-man sub. The crew on skipjack was confounded. Their shotguns and rifles didn't seem very competitive. Then someone yelled, "There's another one!" A second submarine was surfacing off the port side of the skipjack. It was just as huge as the first one, and now the skipjack was sandwiched between 2 huge submarines. They decided to get out of there. Smitty pushed the throttle to full speed, and the skipjack jumped ahead at her full 12 knots. Within a minute, however, it was apparent that the subs were also doing 12 knots, and they were beginning to herd the skipjack out to sea away from Catalina. Smitty closed the throttle and then put the skipjack in reverse. She stopped dead in the water, and the big submarines kept going straight ahead. Smitty then put her hard over to starboard and pointed skipjack for Church Rock at full throttle again, passing astern of the first submarine that had appeared. The submarines disappeared in the darkness astern of the skipjack, and after a few minutes everyone started breathing normally again because the submarines were not chasing them. Smitty made an emergency radio call to Army at San Pedro as the skipjack proceeded at full speed back to Catalina. He reported the submarine sighting, and the Army said thanks. The next morning at the pleasure pier, Sam and Smitty and the others told the whole town of Avalon of their harrowing experience. We were more than ever convinced that the Japanese were coming and would very shortly attack Catalina and all of Southern California. But we weren't going to do any more patrols with rifles and shotguns. The subs were way too big and dangerous for amateurs to deal with. This is not the end of the story. 2 nights later, I stood with, I believe, the whole town of Avalon on Crescent Avenue, looking across the channel towards San Pedro. Avalon was completely blacked out. It was pitch black. There were low clouds above the channel, but our visibility was clear under the clouds. We could see searchlights probing the sky over San Pedro and Long Beach, and the flash of exploding anti-aircraft shells up in the clouds. Then the whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of the cannons would drift across the water. We thought surely that the Japanese were bombing Los Angeles. Late the next day, however, we found out via the fisherman's grapevine what had really happened. A Japanese submarine, probably one that our men had encountered, had boldly sailed into San Pedro Harbor on the surface, and with its deck cannon had sunk a tanker alongside a dock at Terminal Island. When the Army saw the explosion and flames, they assumed they were under an airplane attack as at Pearl Harbor and started shooting aimlessly into the sky. The sub cruised safely out of the harbor and was never a target. It was not until the next morning, when fishermen and dock workers reported the actual events, that the true nature of the attack was recognized. That next night, the cruising submarines attacked again. They shelled a small oil refinery located on the beach near Santa Barbara and set it afire. Both submarines were seen from shore during that attack. All of the fishermen were very aware and very concerned. It was several months before we started to relax and feel that invasion was not just around the corner. And that's the end of Bill's story, but oh my gosh, it makes it so vivid what it must have felt like not to know the ending of the war and to be living through that. I love this. I love just how it brings back what it must have felt like at the beginning of World War II. So that's the submarine story. And this is Sue Riccolo signing off.
Yes, well, my name is Ralph Clark, and I was stationed over here during the war for about 3 years. And I was a petty officer first class, working in the physical training and sea safety department. That's where we got the trainees for the merchant marine that would come over here, and we teach them the ropes in 5 weeks so that they were ready to go out on board ship. And so we had to get them in shape physically, and then also teach them how to abandon ship, how to wear a life jacket when they jump from the side, and how to swim through burning gasoline. So it was quite an experience, and I'd like to tell you that in 1945, well, it was I guess 1944 Christmas, the USO sent over a whole bunch of girls for a nice Christmas dance over here.
In the casino?
And at the casino, yes. And I had been on Liberty at my folks' house, and I was coming back on the same boat, which was the Avalon at that time, as all these USO girls were. And when you know it, I spotted one there that I really liked, and I asked her to meet me at the dance. So she said she would. And 3 months later, we were married. And we came back to the island after a quick honeymoon up to Santa Barbara. And we, for the sake of history, we had the center apartment on Joe Guyon's hillside home up there. And it was really interesting because I remember the rent at that time was $35 a month and all utilities paid. So when President Roosevelt died, that there was a big assembly and marching where we all assembled at the ballpark and then marched from the ballpark down into downtown Avalon, and there we would end the march. And I was in the color guard at the station at that time, and I remember it well because President Roosevelt, we were wondering how the war was ever going to end, you know, and he was the one in charge. And one of them's my bicycle with me on it, which I called my island limousine. That was their transportation. And around being on personnel, I had to move from place to place. And anyhow, but one interesting looking at the bike, I remember the fact it was Norma Jean Doherty was married to one of my best friends that was serving with me here, Jim Doherty, and we were on different duty sections. So the nights when he had the duty, and there was a movie at the casino that all the troops and everyone got to see, and all personnel, he asked me if I would ride Norma Jean down to the show to see it. And so, in other words, I did that 2 or 3 times for him, and it was really strange that afterwards I find out this gal turned out to be Marilyn Monroe. You know, really nice lady, and Jim as well, man.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining us with those to watch those videos. It's heartwarming to hear them. It's also frightening to hear what the war was like at that time. So I want to open it up for questions. We can do a little Q&A with Stephanie. She's been so gracious. She's actually in Northwest Connecticut right now. Just so you all know, she's on a little bit of a different time zone. She's staying up late for us. If you have some questions about Norman Rockwell, about the exhibit, this is the time to ask, or any questions to share with the community about World War II. I think that's appropriate as well. Anybody have?
These were amazing. So beautiful. So well done.
Thank you.
Fascinating.
So if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll read them for you, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question. So feel free. And I also believe that the Pences are with us as well. So if you have any questions for them, if Bill or Stephanie, since she was so gracious to be with, if you have any questions there, let us know.
I'm wondering if any of you got the Saturday Evening Post as young people. Did anyone remember the Post? Yeah?
That's a great question.
Did you have a subscription? Yeah.
The Hinchcliffes did, it sounds like. That's good. Excellent. Well, we can't wait for you all to see the exhibition. I think we were proud to be able to go through our archive and find some of these oral histories of some beloved folks like Jeannie Hill, who are no longer with us. to be able to share her story still. And we just couldn't be more thrilled to put some of that out to you. We have some additional ones that we found also in our archive that we will be sharing throughout the exhibition as we use this exhibition to help us talk about that time on the island for the next 6 months. So there'll be more to come from us on that. Let's see. Stephanie, for the Norman Rockwell Museum, what do you guys have as your main exhibition right now?
You know, we always have original art by Norman Rockwell up, so part of our permanent collection. And right now we actually have a children's book exhibition up in addition by the illustrator Jan Brett. So some of you may remember her book, The Mitten, and she's done like 40 children's books. So that was really fun to have over the holidays. And we do have constantly changing exhibitions. So if anybody gets out to the Northeast and you happen to be in Massachusetts, we would love to see you.
And
But
specifically,
what a beautiful part of the country you live in. It's spectacular.
and Stephanie, what right now are you personally working on? I know that you've just done so many shows, and as the chief curator there or other side projects, what are you working on at the museum?
Oh, thank you for asking. We are actually working on a large catalog and exhibition called Imprinted, Illustrating Race, and it looks at about 3.5 centuries of portrayals of race in widely circulated illustrations. So that's been an interesting project, and that'll open in June.
That's got to be incredible, especially, you know, and you touched on it in your talk about how the Saturday Evening Post, you know, kind of had a policy to not talk about race, or if it did, you know, the people of color were put in subservient, or they were children in the illustrations that were on the cover, and that's what they required of Norman Rockwell. And so he was able to kind of address more of that kind of, I mean, I know he wasn't a political person, but when he was talking about the justice and you know, he's got so many iconic paintings that actually address race and social equity. And I think that I'm excited to hear what you're going to be doing with this, and I hope to be able to come and visit.
Thank you. We would love to see you, and I'm looking forward to your advertising exhibit too.
Oh, yes. Oh, no, we'll talk a lot about that in the meantime, because I have so many questions.
Does anybody have a favorite Norman Rockwell painting? Well, maybe when you come to the exhibit, you will.
Can you select just one?
Something's going to jump out at you. It's hard
Right.
to select one.
And any islanders that I see, or island folks here in that I can see, anybody have any memories of, or have heard memories about World War II on the island to share? This would be a great time to do that as well. I know that when we put it out to the on social media, we put it out and someone said, I was 3 years old and I remember it, you know, the blackout and it being very uncertain, but as a 3-year-old, that person was like, I didn't really understand what was happening, but looking back, it must have been very scary. But the 3-year-old didn't necessarily seem scared because they weren't quite sure exactly what was happening. So that was kind of an interesting point of view too, just from the younger side of things.
If no one has anything to share right now, I do ask that please reach out to the museum, because we would love to hear the stories. Throughout, as Gail mentioned, this is we'll be having, Stephanie has graciously lent us this show for 6 months. So this is the time where we'll be talking about World War II and, you know, even present situations that are, you know, the politics are similar in some aspects. And so it gives us a nice platform to discuss war, to discuss race, to discuss so many different things. So please reach out to the museum and we'll happily talk about these things. It's a great platform for this. So thank you. And specific thank you to the Norman Rockwell Museum, to Stephanie, and all of you for joining us.
And thank you so much. We're thrilled to work with you, and we appreciate everything you've done. Beautiful work. And please go and see this great exhibition.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, everybody. We're so glad that you could join us on this Friday evening. And next month for our first Fridays at the museum, we'll be back in person. We're planning, since it falls on April Fool's Day, we're planning a comedy night, and we hope that you'll all come and join us in person. And we'll see you in the exhibition soon. It opens to the public tomorrow at 10 a.m. And then it also is the last weekend to see Gary Miltimore Water and Color, which closes on Sunday at 5 p.m. So it's a great weekend to come and visit and get over to the island. If you can. The weather might be a little iffy, so if not, we'll be here and we'll await your arrival. So thank you so much to everyone, and thanks to Keith in our control room for keeping it all together. We appreciate you, and yeah, have a good night.
Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.